Coming up, if you care about employment opportunities, if you care about being able to support your family with your earnings, if you care about being able to save for retirement, if you care about your kids being able to prosper financially, the time for supporting Democrat candidates has passed. The party can no longer legitimately claim the mantle of growth. They have abandoned it. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Anyone who's listened to this podcast knows that in presidential elections, I basically vote based on two issues, the economy and national security, and only recently have I added protection of our free speech rights because I see them as under such a threat from the left and big tech. I talk to people all the time who similarly say that they vote based on the economy. To my amazement, some of the people that say that are Democrats and vote for Democrats. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's a pretty extreme position for me to take, to basically say anybody who wants a strong economy can't possibly vote for Democrats. Well, I'm saying that now. I've always supported Republican candidates, and I've typically thought they were the best for the economy. But I haven't always said you can't possibly support Democrats and claim that you're voting based on needing a strong economy. On balance, Republicans have been right, in my view, much more than Democrats over time. But it hasn't always been true that it's essentially impossible to justify voting for Democrats if you say you want a strong economy. That's a more recent development, and it's a function of the incredible extent to which the Democratic Party has moved to the left. And the result of that move to the left has included a near abandonment of economic growth as a fundamental goal of the party. But that abandonment has not been restricted to the Democrat Party in America. Look at what's happening with the left elsewhere. Quillette magazine looked at it and came up with some startling conclusions. So what exactly did they look at? Well, they looked at the focus on economic growth, or in the case of the Democratic Party and other leftist parties in the West, the lack of focus on economic growth. For as long as I can remember, political parties in the West have seen economic growth as a bottom line, a key, perhaps the key, to economic success as a party and political success as a party. Think about how many articles you've read over the years that depict the success of Ronald Reagan in coming out of the severe recession the country was suffering. The incredible growth which he was able to achieve, totaling a whopping 32% increase in GDP over the course of his presidency, and the beginnings of that growth were a key to his landslide re-election victory. How many commentators over the years have made the point that the beginning of that incredible growth was the signal to the electorate that Ronald Reagan was going to succeed in getting the country out of the recession with a strong recovery? Now think about the criticisms from the right against Barack Obama when his team and much of the media talked about how the strong growth numbers after recessions which had been experienced in the past were no longer achievable. I remember thinking at the time that it was just a convenient excuse, that the media once again was making excuses, making life easier for President Obama. But now I realize it's much more than that. The left has abandoned economic growth as a goal. It's not about growing an economy anymore. It's about redistributing what's there. They're not trying to make it bigger. They're trying to change the split of the slices of the pie. And for the leftist environmentalists who are such a critical part of their base, economic growth is actually contrary to their goal. The message that the human race is destroying the planet has become so central to leftist thinking that the goal for many is to shrink the economy, to return us to some sort of purportedly more pure, primitive existence. Try to wrap your head around a party trying to run on that position. How do they do it? Well, one way is to circulate unrealistic pie-in-the-sky claims that the environmental technologies will pay so well and promote such broad employment that they will grow the economy. Never mind the fact that result hasn't happened anywhere. I suppose some people will buy it, but how many? The Quillette article by Joel Kotkin, entitled The Growth Dilemma, appeared on January 9. It points out what I recall vividly, that Bill Clinton, only 2 Democrat presidents ago, was a vocal proponent of economic growth. He talked about it regularly, and frankly, once the Republicans took over Congress and he chose to work with them, they did a pretty good job of promoting economic growth. Barack Obama, on the other hand, didn't do such a great job, but he didn't do a horrible one either. His actions helped to slow the pace of recovery from the recession, but he still talked about the importance of economic growth. Frankly, it was primarily many in the media who called into question whether the growth of prior periods, the 1980s and late 1990s, was still possible. If you're like me, you've concluded that in large part the media was running interference for Barack Obama by questioning whether the growth seen in prior recoveries from recessions was still possible. As I've said before, their coverage of President Obama was best described as worshipful. And what better way to show their worship of President Obama than by lowering economic expectations to take the pressure off of him? But we're in a new period now. Have you noticed? Democrats are not simply talking about how hard it is to achieve the growth of prior periods. Hardly any of them are talking about growth at all. Their focus is on how to redistribute what we have as a country. It isn't about growing what we have as a country. I guess you could argue that that change occurred incrementally, but if so, it was one very large increment. And that first step was when Barack Obama was answering a debate question during his 2008 Democrat presidential primary campaign. He was asked about his push to dramatically raise capital gains taxes. It was during the presidential primary debate between Obama and Hillary Clinton. Moderator Charlie Gibson noted that in previous instances when the capital gains tax was lowered, revenues actually increased. But when capital gains taxes were raised, revenues decreased. In light of that, Charlie Gibson asked, why raise capital gains taxes at all? Barack Obama's response? Quote, for purposes of fairness, close quote. I vividly remember that eye-opening exchange, and at that moment it became crystal clear that Barack Obama was about redistribution of wealth. He was willing to dramatically raise taxes, even if doing so would bring in less revenue. The tax wasn't a means to an end, it was the end itself. Every taxpayer should have been frightened by that exchange. But I submit what's happening now is more frightening still. From that one increment of stepping from a Democrat president, Bill Clinton, who lowered capital gains taxes and was able to bring in more revenue as a result, and who routinely talked about the importance of economic growth, to the next Democrat president who endorsed raising taxes even when the effect was to reduce tax revenue, and who downplayed the ability to achieve the growth of prior decades, we've now taken one enormous step, one increment, to an assortment of Democratic presidential candidates who don't focus on growth at all, who instead focus on splitting up what we have. Nearly every one of them has endorsed banning fracking, the economic engine driving a substantial portion of the growth of the last 10 years, and has brought America to a state of energy independence and insulated America from much of the oil market upheavals in the unstable Middle East. If you care about employment opportunities, if you care about being able to support your family with your earnings, if you care about being able to save for retirement, if you care about your kids being able to prosper financially, the time for supporting Democrat candidates has passed. The party can no longer legitimately claim the mantle of growth. They have abandoned it. I've always been a conservative. I've been a Republican throughout my entire life, but I've known Democrats as friends and acquaintances forever. Sure, we had disagreements, but we still seem to be seeking the same end result, a safe and secure and prosperous country for ourselves and our kids. But I've never seen and never really envisioned what the Democratic Party has become. They're no longer seeking prosperity, and frankly, every Democrat out there who wants a prosperous country for himself and his kids should vote Republican. If that happened, would it bring the Democrat Party back to sanity, to pursuit of prosperity? I don't know. But the only way I can see it ever happening is if Democrats abandon the party in droves. And if they do, it will be a glorious election. Next topic. Frightening new prospect for authoritarianism. If you're like me, you're concerned about how far the left is willing to push the climate change issue. I've watched their seemingly endless number of attempts to ramp up the issue to convince the public to accept all manner of increasingly restrictive but futile measures. Take a look at the recent adoption of the phrase climate emergency. Once again, even after apocalyptic prediction after apocalyptic prediction has not come true, they're still peddling the idea that there simply is no more time, that we have to act now no matter what the cost. So with that backdrop, with that history, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by what I read last month. On December 3 in Breitbart, in an article by Simon Kent, I read about a Danish academic, Ole Weaver, a well-known international relations professor at the University of Copenhagen. Think about what I'm about to tell you in the context of other left-wing authoritarian tendencies. The tendency to restrict your speech, to label speech with which they disagree as violence, to mandate use of particular pronouns, and to prohibit applications of particular pronouns to persons who dispute that they apply to them, to restrict your right to bear arms, to ban the energy extraction technology which has been such an economic boon to the country, fracking, to force you to violate your religious beliefs if those beliefs conflict with paying for insurance which covers abortion, for example, to restrict your ability to buy beef by levying exorbitant taxes upon it, to impose overwhelmingly expensive carbon neutrality mandates on the construction of all new buildings per the proposed Green New Deal. We've all seen those proposed by the left and in some cases actually implemented. And if you think about the ease, the eagerness with which they've been proposed, nothing should surprise you. So, with that background, what exactly did this Danish academic suggest? He suggested that the United Nations might take military action against countries which defy its climate change mandates. And he apparently recognizes that could potentially threaten democracy. Quote, the United Nations Security Council could, in principle, tomorrow, decide that climate change is a threat to international peace and security, close quote. He apparently recognizes the disturbing nature of what he's suggesting could occur. Quote, that's what happens when something becomes a security issue. It gets the urgency, the intensity, the priority, which is sometimes helpful, but it also lets the dark forces loose in the sense that it can justify problematic means, close quote. There's another eye-opening statement from this professor. Quote, if there was something that was decided internationally by some more centralized procedure, and every country was told, this is your emission target, it's not negotiable, we can actually take military measures if you don't fulfill it, then you would basically have to get that down the throat of your population, whether they like it or not. Close quote. How about that? Think about that in the context of this recent adoption of the verbiage climate emergency. The authoritarian tendencies of the left will continue to be a threat, and the possibility this professor is raising must be taken seriously because of those authoritarian tendencies. As long as Donald Trump is in office, any such proposal in the Security Council would be thankfully vetoed by the United States. but you put some of the extremists running the Democratic nomination in that position, and we've got a real constitutional fight on our hands. We had better be prepared, and the best preparation remains defeating every leftist at the ballot box. Next topic. Latest example of the decline of professionals and elite institutions. Perhaps it's just that we have so many sources of information now that we're more acutely aware of when professionals behave unprofessionally and when elite institutions seem far from deserving of being labeled elite. But it just seems like this happens more often now than it used to. Let's take psychiatrists, for example. Go back far enough and you won't find them on TV engaging in analysis of patients who've agreed to appear in front of an audience. Go back far enough and you encounter a belief among those professionals that such conduct is inappropriate, that such psychoanalysis should be engaged in private, not in front of a live audience with scores more watching on television, but now seemingly anything goes. But that's not the latest example of the decline of professionals. The latest example is not an example of the tendency to put anything on television, but rather an example of how everything is now political. This circumstance involves a professor of forensic psychology, Dr. Bandy Lee. So what exactly did Dr. Lee do? Dr. Lee has diagnosed a major public figure, himself a professional, as suffering from psychosis, even though she's never met him. And as the public figure points out in an article in GatesstoneInstitute.org, she hasn't examined him, hasn't seen his medical records, and has never spoken to anyone close to him. So who is this public figure? It's Alan Dershowitz, Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, Harvard Law School, one of the most prominent and accomplished legal professors and appellate attorneys in the country. As Dershowitz points out in the January 11 article, according to Dr. Lee, the evidence of his psychosis is his expressing legal views on the constitutional rights of President Trump. She apparently has classified Professor Dershowitz as one of President Trump's, quote, followers, close quote. Although, as he points out, he's a liberal Democrat who voted for Hillary Clinton. But if you're a psychiatrist willing to publicly render a diagnosis without meeting, examining, viewing the medical records of, or talking to anyone close to the person being diagnosed, I guess that level of factual error doesn't bother you. Incidentally, her diagnosis of Professor Dershowitz is par for the course. She's previously diagnosed President Trump as psychotic as well, once again without ever examining him or his medical records. And incidentally, per Professor Dershowitz, Dr. Lee is contending that President Trump and the bulk of his followers suffer from some sort of shared psychosis. Given that I voted for President Trump and have come to be more and more impressed with his performance as president, which I'll admit is in many respects better than I expected, I guess she would say I'm suffering from that shared psychosis as well. So what university is this forensic psychiatrist associated with? Is it one that we might consider to be of mediocre standing? Perhaps one far from the centers of population and power within the country? Some secondary state institution with relatively affordable tuition and populated with relatively few students from the tops of their high school classes? Perhaps one you would derisively label as a party school, asserting that much of the student body as a practical matter is actually informally pursuing a degree in mixology or pungent botanical pursuits. No, Dr. Lee is a professor of forensic psychology at a university where the cost of attending for a single undergraduate year, tuition and fees alone, not including room and board, is $55,000. Dr. Lee is a professor at Yale University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. And these absurdities, issuing psychiatric diagnoses of public figures, the President of the United States and his supporters, without ever meeting or examining any of them, is coming from a professor at that institution. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. There was a time when we expected better, but now, unfortunately, we often expect nearly nothing at all. Yale should be embarrassed. But are they? I don't know. Given the diagnoses are negative about President Trump, and much of academia is obsessed with their hatred of President Trump, perhaps they're proud. Who knows? But what I do know is it's embarrassing how professional standards and the standards of elite institutions have collapsed when it comes to anything political and anything which involves a diversity of opinions and deviation from the extreme orthodoxies of the modern left. But I know one thing which hasn't collapsed, and that is my commitment to get back to you each and every week with another episode of Political Spirits. I look forward to speaking to you next week. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And we're on Instagram now as well at Political Spirits. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.